we start, I would like to ask Professor Raffaella Neri from Milano to present her her speech, Tradition as Avant-Garde, Ernesto Rogers and Ignazio Gardella. Professor, floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, as every year. So, I think it's not possible to talk about the relationship between architecture and history in Milan without first considering Ernesto Rogers, a tireless supporter of a theme which would become crucial for a post-war Italian architecture. A rereading of history tells us of the renewal of our architecture in a moment of stasis, of a reiteration of forms void of their expressive potential, in opposition both to monumentalism and to an impoverished rationalism, what Aldo Rossi would later define as naive functionalism. History was seen as an indispensable identifying element on which to pin a new modernity. This road would lead far to the point of laying down scientific foundation for architecture and to open a fertile period of urban studies. Consequently, in response to the solicitation of the conference themes, we might argue that in Italy, in the second half of the 20th century, history brought in a new avant-garde. It may have been the war and the reconstruction that prompted the reflection, posing the first important question: how should be rebuilt? How can we recover a collective identity reflected in the conformation of sites now destroyed by bombing? What forms should the place of future life take? In Milan, a city whose monuments and housing were wounded in great measure, this theme sparked hot debates in that period of idealism and positive faith in the future, with a mutual understanding that only on past history would it be possible to found the future. A new modernity could not forget its own identity, which was not neutral and indifferent, but the bearer of authentic life, of the values and culture of society and the modern city. This theme was strongly posed by Ernesto Rogers in the pages of Casabella, the magazine he directed, adding the term continuity. The core concept was that there is a clear difference between history and tradition. History is the succession of events, an objective and documentable fact, while tradition is that which resists change, the vital nucleus that remains, the meaning underlying human action and culture, relatively constant over time. Tradition, the element that endures beyond any particular forms, is what guarantees the continuity of history. Between history and tradition lies the difference that exists between phenomenon and idea. And these two words, that of ideas and that of phenomenal reality, or of experience, as Rogers called it, coexist and nourish each other. There is no conflict between them, but an inescapable need to base modernity on tradition. In this sense, tradition becomes a choice. It is not an objective datum, it must be recognized and selected, and it is necessary to specify the way to put it into practice and to make it up to date in order to review its cultural significance in other forms. This is the question around which many architects worked on the basis of the positions of Ernesto Rogers, with the contribution of many of his peers and of the students who continued this research. I shall limit myself here to talking about certain specific issues. I shall try to explain them by relying on the thought of Ernesto Rogers and to show how they can be recognized in the architecture of Ignazio Gardella. Ignazio Gardella, Milanese by culture, Genoese by family, Venetian by school, was an architect-engineer who is not easy to interpret because his work of architecture are all formally different from one another. And this richness makes it difficult to force them in the categories that historiography usually offer us. But for this reason, I think it's interesting to try to recognize in them some of the themes related to the issue we are dealing with. Gardella never began from the forms of architecture. Instead, he reflected on the meaning, on the nature of things. The problem was no longer an optimization of the functional response of a building, a technical question, but a search for its deepest meaning, its value for our culture, and of course, its transposition into forms. It was a search for an assonance between the values and the forms that must bring a renewed interpretation. The idea of functionalism was replaced by that of the representation of a value and a culture. And Gardella conducted this research free from any formally pre-established constraints, but within a rational method, another of the themes which Rogers insisted on, and in a classical idea of architecture. The freedom of thought allowed Gardella great depth in the answer to the problems he tackled, with a consequent formal richness in the works themselves. Something remained, we said, yet much changes. Was it possible to define tools that allowed us to know this element of permanence, the deepest core of architecture as handed down by history? What does this element of continuity with history, this nucleus, subject to incessant changes of forms, correspond to in architecture? Neither Rogers nor Gardella explicitly mentioned typology, but back in 1959, Giulio Carlo Argan had already highlighted this idea of continuity in Gardella's architecture, which translated into an adherence to some traditional typologies. The two examples of the Church of Cesate and the Church of San Donato both tackled the theme of the nave, a traditional spatial structure, but still appropriate to the rite and the liturgy, which therefore had no reason to be changed. In both of these churches, Gardella paid great attention to the character of the sacred place, as specified by the measurement, proportion, and lighting. He used modern construction techniques and ancient materials, but reproposed a low-pitched roof, which is also an element of recognizability of the theme and of spatial unity for a community. The House Barbieri, one of the first buildings constructed after the war, is a rural house of great simplicity. On the plaster volume, cut into two to make room for the entrance and the large opening of the living room, against all the dictates of the modern movement, a double-pitched roof lays on top. Perhaps to recall a rural tradition and to make the house more involved with the landscape, except that the two pitches are asymmetrical and upside down inside, in the opposite direction of that of tradition. The house was a theme particularly dear to Ignazio Gardella. In this period, in the project of new expansions and the replacement of the destroying building, the question of the relationship with the way of constructing the city in history was crucial. In general terms, Ernesto Rogers called this problem a question of the relationship with environmental pre-existences, arguing the needing to grasp the existing values of the environment and to redefine this in fresh forms. The term environment included not only rational data, but sensible aspects. It is a term which contains a certain vagueness, of interpretation, but indicates the difficulty of the work and the direction of the future research. Gardella designed houses that were different from the old ones without ever being indifferent to history. He looked for continuity with life and with the city without nostalgia or camouflage, but also without giving up on being modern. He pursued his project pursued these objectives both in bourgeois houses, such as the Villa Borletti, and in popular ones. He was guided by the aim of giving shape to an idea of domesticity, of rediscovering the value of the house in its relationship with places, in the quality of its interior spaces, in the lights, in the use of both new and old materials, in the size of the openings, which he favored at full height from floor to ceiling, to be able to look outside, even when sitting down, he said. He tried to give shape to a domestic intimacy that belonged to our way of living, to build a house that resembles us, that resemble, as Rogers suggested, my humanity in beauty. The elements he usually put in place were simple. Volumes covered in clinker, something which makes the surface vibrant with a dark color, as in the condominium at the Gardens of Hercules, in contrast with the long white metallic railings, as in the poor house of the Milanese tradition, which bring rhythm to the volume, and protected balconies of different depths with large glazed openings for bright lighting, looking out over a historical garden. The Borsalino Employees House in Alessandria, on the fringes of the urban center, is aligned with the road on one side, while facing the countryside on the other. The volume is divided into parts that define tall blocks ordered in a broken geometry with a dark clinker cladding, in which high windows open, shielded by traditional shutters sliding on thin track. Here the roof is flat. It is one of the identifying elements of the house and is highlighted through the narrative of its construction elements, almost as if it were a traditional wooden construction with the protrusion of the beams and the thin plane of the roof. Gardella was particularly fond of his project for the Vicenza Theatre, which was never built. Its stereometric volume strongly affirms a clear idea of modernity, while being born in continuity with the still-alive tradition of Italian theatre. Gardella set out from the current meaning of a theatre to identify what is indispensable and alive of its ritual, of its magic. The answer became the reason behind the form of his architecture. He designed the theatre starting from the nucleus, which he recognized as the idea generating theatricality, the creation of two distinct places, the place of the actor and the place of the spectator, opposed and frontal, separate yet united in the staging of a non-existent but still truthful world. A dim space, unitary as a square volume can be, and at the same time a double space, split in two by a clean cut that separates the parts which, as in the theatre of history, differ in height. An idea represented with depth and precision in a continuity of meaning with tradition, but far distant from its forms, because the shapes are different and variable, like the materials and the construction techniques, and in this case, forms are taken to the limit of abstraction, an abstraction which is through thought process, one which aims to identify the essential element here reflected in the precise geometry of the volume. In many of Gardella projects, the confrontation with history is direct. Gardella did it several times over the years, when he designed the Museum of Contemporary Art at the Villa Reale in Milano on the site of the villa's damaged stables, maintaining the grounds, changing the destination, and giving shape to one of the most beautiful exhibition spaces in Milan. Measured, bright, divided into different spaces for each type of exhibition, facing the garden with a long window, which becomes a continuation of the exhibition outdoor. It also did so in the reconstruction of the ancient thermal bath in Ischia, maintaining the ancient colonnaded front, a memory of the place, kept clearly distinct and separate from the new addition. And again, it did so with an extremely complex urban project, which involved the selection, demolition, and rebuilding of parts of it. It was the detailed plan for the war-damaged area of San Donato and San Silvestro in Genoa, which ended with the construction of the Faculty of Architecture, a building which grafted onto the site of the former church of San Silvestro, but enlarged, rises like a new cathedral on the top of the hill, a volume built with a series of modern buttresses, which is not afraid to show its size and its modernity, and with this, its importance as a public institution. Because even a restoration or reconstruction is an architectural project, argues Ernesto ROGERS, and has the task of bringing new life to a building or a part of the city, destroyed or disused, grafting new values onto its history, fearless of changing its forms, in search of that delicate balance which Gardella managed to establish between the old and the new. In 1992, along with Aldo Rossi, he conceived the reconstruction of the old theatre of Genova, Carlo Felice. Here, once again, the tradition of the Italian theatre, with its two parts of cavea and stage tower, was reinterpreted and reproposed in a modern key in very different ways from the theatre of Vicenza, thanks to its pre-existence, its urban role, and the collaboration with Aldo Rossi. They reinterpreted the cavea as a public square or a courtyard and gave the cityscape the extraordinary landmark of the stage tower. There is another important issue in the search for continuity with history. This concerns the relationship with technique and construction, the most subject to mutation over time, which directly reflects an idea of modernity and progress. Ignazio Gardella, an engineer by training with a degree in architecture, enjoyed an advantage with a clear idea of the role that structural problems play without sentiment of inferiority or mythologizing, knowing well the expressive possibilities and quality of the construction elements. I go a bit faster. And among others, the clearest awareness of the expressive potential of structure typologies is well shown in the house in the park, a trouble project where the quality of the places in the house and their different relationship with the city are recounted by the wall volume of the bedroom area, more intimate and reserved, in contrast with the trilytic system of a loggia of different depth in the living room with open onto the park. Gardella did not carry through many large-scale urban projects, but they certainly shared an approach which united the architects working in those years. Every work of architecture, even the smallest, was the construction of a piece of the city. It could not ignore its urban role or modify the site where it is located, but had to seek continuity with the pre-existing. the city historical past is an essential component of the urban planning problem with Argan. And again, Gardella's architecture reacted to spaces, seeking a relationship with it that was never extraneous. The House of the Zattere was in this sense an attempt to relate to, or rather to insert itself into one of the most particular and inimitable environmental pre-existent in the world, without nostalgia and without reusing the formal elements typical of Venice. I conclude by going back to the beginning. Is there continuity in this research, or is it the outcome of some of many different episodes? It is my belief that the continuity which should interest us, the one that interests Gardella, Rogers, and many others, is that of life and its values, which architecture must poetically witness. As in life, architecture must continually go in search of its own meaning without settling for the causes and obvious solution, because as in life, meaning is to be found, pursued, built, and manifest in ever-changing and even surprising forms. In Gardella's work, this link was always grasped, as if the forms of the architecture were a direct emanation of the life they contain, subdivided into domesticity, time for work, rest, play, study, and so on. This perhaps is the reason why in all of his works of architecture, it is easy to recognize their forms as one's own. It is easy to share them. It is easy to belong to them as if they had always been there. Thanks.